Welcome to the podcast of ReMO, the Researcher Mental Health Observatory. In the previous season of this podcast, we have heard the stories of 3 brave researchers who came forward to share their struggles on their journey through academia. In this season, we meet 3 guests who bring a different perspective. They talk about the reality of academia today, both at personal and systemic level, commenting on what works and what doesn't, and most importantly, on how to move forward. In other words, they contribute to a transformation of the research ecosystem to benefit well-being and mental health of the professionals, the people who work in it. Quote, "We refuse to see things for what they are and ask why. We want to envision things that never were and ask, why not?" I am Federica Bressan and I welcome you on this podcast. Welcome everybody. Today we've been speaking with Wainer Lusoli, Deputy Head of Unit of the European Research Executive Agency. In the first part of our conversation, Wainer has pointed out some of the mega trends that define the scientific ethos, and he has commented on how they have been changing through time, referring to the discourse of meta-science and all the factors that eventually impact how science is done in the day-to-day activity of the researchers. Some of the factors are speed, the mechanization of science, the professionalization of science, the monetization and the industrialization of science. Ethics plays a big role too. Ethics that is not written in stone, but co-evolves with society. Wainer, you have mentioned these megatrends and mostly their negative effects. In the second part of our conversation, I would like to ask you if there is anything positive about them, what is desirable about them that we may want to keep in planning our way forward, trying to orient the next transformation of science in a way that safeguards and ensures the personal well-being of the professionals of science.
Well, it's a good point actually you're raising. So some of these trends are clearly not desirable. I wouldn't want to say good or bad, but not desirable. Clearly the pressure to publish, if it's exaggerated, then of course it leads to no good outcome. And working double shifts nobody likes, and it's unfair in most of the cases. So clearly it's negatives. But some other trends bring with them innovations and bring with them new working practices. They change the fabric of how research is done. So from that point of view, the mechanization, not necessarily a bad thing, as long as it brings with it transparency. So saying more people get access to research results because of this process of mechanization. So better data management, better recording of the research protocols, better recording of the human protocols behind the research protocols. And at the same time, if mechanization increases accountability, so you know who contributed to what finding, it may increase the fairness of the system and work in the favor of the people who actually did the work in the lab, not the big professor behind the scenes, but actually the researchers keeping the research logs in the labs. You see, so mechanization in itself, that doesn't lead to negative outcomes if it's harnessed properly. Transparency is very good, accountability is very good, desirable. Everybody would agree on that. Whether that changes the social dynamic of research groups, I say the jury is out on that one. I think policymakers are looking at that. Right now, there's been quite a lot of discussion and agreements, at least the European Union, on reforming research assessment in a way that takes into account the contribution of everybody in the research pipeline. So if mechanization increases transparency and accountability, and you have this capacity to record everybody's contribution fairly, then you give back to the community that actually does the job. Not saying that the big professor with 40 years of experience is not contributing. Of course they are. They're guiding, they're mentoring, they're doing. But at the same time, mechanization may imply a bit of a democratization of science. If, in the right circumstances, big words say, they cum grano salis. But it may. And the same goes for the speed of research. If we get faster to the vaccine, but it's good. Why should it be bad? If because preprints are available sooner for the scrutiny of the community, or blueprints for hydrogen plants are shared with the community faster. What's wrong with that? As long as you keep them open and as long as the protocols are visible. And I go now into this issue, but just as an example of algorithmic transparency. Clearly, algorithms help us, but they do help us as long as we control what the algorithm does for us. And the same, mutatis mutandis, can go for science. So the mechanization of science and the speeding of research is good when it is documented, when it's an open process and transparent, and linked to virtuous dynamic of recognition of merit, especially by those who come to the science maybe at the beginning of their careers. Because the others have the connections in the journals. They don't need fast science. So they keep publishing what they publish. Excellent research. Let me say that. I'm not against that, not at all. Nobody's against that. But they have the vehicles. If these changes in science open new doors for the scientists, for new scientists thinking in a different way, then more breakthroughs, more innovations, no doubt about that. And the same goes for the other trend I was talking about. Increasing responsibility and accountability. It's a double-edged sword, there's no doubt about that. Of course, it creates a burden. You need to work double shift. And I'll say it again, people shouldn't work double shifts. But at the same time, if you give you a venue, a channel, opens a door to a publication, to a new audience, to the public, then it's putting you in the right place. And you may be enjoying in your 30s, actually, this game. It's a bit of game. There's been a talk as well of gamification of science. You see this idea that you need to have fun. So it can't just be 8 hours in the lab and 2 hours on the blog. It just doesn't make any sense for everybody. Can we make it fun for the people coming to science and you? And I'm talking about kids. I'm talking about PhD students. I've seen very many bored PhD students that at the end they didn't know what to do with a PhD, not because it was no good, but because they thought this is too much for me. Do I want to do this for 60 years? No, 60, 30 maybe, but if you go to the emeritus stages, then it could be easily 60. So I think some of these trends have intrinsic potential to be poetic, to generate more good science and more happiness, let us say.
Okay, so we got some negatives and some positives of the system down and say we are ready to sit down at a table and plan change, to plan actions that will change the current state of affairs, hopefully in a way that benefits the well-being of researchers. The truth of the matter is that academia is made of many different actors, from the young PhD student to the senior professor, to all the members of the faculty and administration, and the policymaker, and the people who manage the funding, and the funders themselves. So it's a complex system, and everybody has a different view of what the system is to them and what's wrong with it. So if you ask different people how they think the system should change, they will give you different answers. A second observation I would make is that in life, it's just a fact of life, many times what's positive about something and what's negative about it are tied together. You cannot get rid of the bad without getting rid of the good. It's like, I like cake, but it makes me fat. You cannot just get rid of cake. Things are very much intertwined, and if not at an obvious level, at a more subtle level. So, bottom line, you realize that you cannot just get rid of what doesn't work in the system, and what you're left with is a system that works perfectly. This doesn't happen. And therefore, planning an action to change things may cause new and unexpected negative effects. So that's a very tricky task. And the third and last part of this very long question for you is, where do you think change should come from? So I'm not asking you, how do you think things should change? How do you think they should be? I'm asking you, where do you think change should come from?
So first of all, I should say, do we agree that we need change?
Or that whether we want it or not, change will come anyway.
So I totally agree on that. So And rephrasing that, do we want different science from the science we have today? Do we think it's unproductive? Do we think it's not leading society in a place we should be? So let's think of change as in good change, as in change for the better, assuming that we agree on the assumptions of what is good change, as in sustainable science that helps society achieve greater happiness, greater prosperity. It's a word I don't like, but what's wrong with prosperity, frankly? So there you go. So if we frame change in that way, who is in the driving seat? Where should change come from? And I've got very clear ideas on this one, but not just me, because I'm a genius, but I think it's quite obvious. It's in the research institutions themselves. The policymaker is steering a boat, or is trying to steer a boat, like a GPS system. So it's not even on the boat. It's just an instrument for the research communities. Of course, it provides funding, but funding is money. But at the same time, more importantly, signaling where the boat should be going. You see, and it gives us steam to this boat. Let's keep with this metaphor. Maybe. Let's try to explore this one. Never thought about it in this way, but there you go. And the ship in this case is the research environments or research institutions or a collective of research institutions that try to navigate the sea of discovery of new things to help society. Let's put it this way. And who works on the ship? Surprise, surprise. At a very lower level on the decks with a coal. It's a coal ship. You see, one of the old-fashioned polluting ships. I guess it would be the researchers. So below the deck, in the third class, using the spades to put the coal in the machine of science, it would be researchers. And who would be the captain of the ship, or the captains? Clearly would be the directors of research institutions. No, not trying to overdo the metaphor, but then again, the question is, where should change come from? I think it should come from the captains of the ship, an institution they represent. So change can be fostered by policymakers, by clear signaling about the priorities, using funding in virtuous ways to create more innovation and less repetition, to sometimes slow down the pace of science and sometimes accelerate when it is needed, and to correct some dynamics we described before, correcting the publish or perish. This is in dire need of reflection and going back to the idea of quality of research, not the number of publications. And the public funders are doing that. So I would say that it should start and end in the research field and with the research organization, research performance organization, universities, and the like, and academies clearly, and this whole ecosystem, because they are the one that driving the change. If institutions willingly change the conditions in which researchers, young researchers, are hired, perform, are paid, and are rewarded, then again you solve big part of the problem. You create a social dampener of the trends. You protect your staff from the trends. You enable them to jump on the wave. And they demonstrated that they can jump on the wave. But they need a little buffer to be able to do that. You don't start surfing with a small and fast surfing board. You start with a large and boring surfing board. It's the same. Institutions, research organization do need to provide this environment that allows the newcomers to absorb the change and to make the most of the change. And this, as we know, research institutions are led by older scholars that in turn need the incentive to change. This is what I intend as change for change's sake. So it starts and ends, I think, with the research organizations. A rejoinder to that has to do with collective responsibility. The older researchers do abide to very high moral and ethical standards. They do. I know they do. There's a ton of literature about that. So fraud and misuse of public funds and the duplication, falsification of research is a tiny, whiny part of the research business. You look at any other business, and I bet you €100 that you can't find a lower rate on non-compliance and or higher rate of malpractice. Societies do really, really good. But still, even if we believe they are doing it for the sake of science and for the good of the public, they do have a responsibility to respond themselves to these trends and try to make the most of it. And then this insistence on the research institutions and research performing organization as the driver doesn't remove the agency of the public funders. But on this one, having been one of the public funders and now helping the REA just direct this public funding, I can certainly tell you that is bread and butter every day. And not just in the European Union, but big research funders in the United States, like the NIH, in Australia, New Zealand, increasingly in the Eastern Research Partners. So they see lots of awareness that you need to help the research organization to change and stay competitive at the same time. It's a game of competition and collaboration. You want to compete on the science that is produced, and you want to compete fiercely. You want your scientists to be competing at the highest level. At the same time, you need to cooperate, and public funders worldwide are cooperating on issues of transparency, on issue of welfare of researchers, on issues of quality of research, getting away from publish or perish. So this kind of GPS system I was describing before in a bit of a crude way is this. Policymakers have the responsibility to set the boundaries and provide incentives for the research institutions to act as a true driver of change.
During our conversation, I have challenged you in the definition of some very complex trends in the science ethos, in the discourse of meta-science, in order to identify some factors that may be responsible for some of the negative impact affecting young researchers today. To conclude, I would like to ask you one last question that concerns another elephant in the room or in the lab, which is the publish or perish mantra. It's often the first to be mentioned when talking about what weighs on the researcher's shoulders, the pressure to publish. If we only didn't have this pressure to publish that's killing us. Even you mentioned it in the first part of this conversation. I challenge this mantra because it's an oversimplification. It suggests that if you don't publish, you drop out of the game. But then it should follow that if you publish, you flourish. And that's not true. If I publish, I don't automatically get a permanent position. I don't get funding. And then publish where? How much? If I publish one paper, I have published. But of course, that's not enough. So how much is enough? So publish or perish suggests that in order not to die, academically speaking, you must publish. And that is simply not true. It may be true that if you don't publish, you perish, but the opposite is not true. You can always perish. Please take this mantra apart for me, if you will.
It's a thorny issue. It's a thorny issue. I do believe. I said I'm guilty. So let's start from there. I said publish or perish. I'm putting ashes on my head. Publish or perish is a bit of a flag. Well, when you say that, or one says that, it really means a wider set of issues in relation to the publishing system, the publishing pipeline. Let's call it this. The main problem with the publishing pipeline is the lack of fairness of the way in which research is evaluated. So, just to be very blunt, the impact factor, which is until today the almost single, again exaggeration, bear with me, but a single criterion by which a researcher is evaluated, or the last 3-5 publication and the dissemination it had, leads to dynamics or is linked to dynamic that are entrenched in the research culture, like chronism, old boys networks, capacity to pitch one's article and to be cited in a certain community, which is not necessarily the most important one for society, but is more sexy, or the most established, or the one that generates more revenue. And we go back to the point I discussed before, monetization of science. So publish or perish is a portmanteau, is a word that means many other things behind it, and it should be used with care. So I totally agree with you. But if you unpack it, and you point, as some research has done, and some analysis also by the European Commission, European institutions, and unpack it and say, what is behind this banner? Where is the problem really? Then you find out that actually you need to reform the whole concept of quality of research. So we should be assessing the quality of it, not the quantity of it. And beyond that, the quality and the variety, and the quality and the diversity, and the quality in the intersectionality, and the capacity of the research to address important public issues. They call them societal challenges, but you can call them in many different ways. People's needs, This is what you need. Or the world's requirements, or the climate disaster. You see. So as long as you're able intellectually to unpack, publish, and perish in the individual components, then again you're doing, I think, a fair job, and a fair job has been done in unpacking it. On the other hand, is a handy term to use. It's a tag. So when you say that, people don't understand what you mean. Maybe they don't agree with some of the assumptions I just spoke out, or they believe there's other assumptions behind the concept. Some may want to see the publishers as the culprits, let's put it this way. Or others may think the research institutions have incentives to perpetuate themselves. And this publish or perish system is a very functional mechanism, you see. So there may be understandings or decodings of this term. But if you keep it simple and say, what is it about really? Is this idea that you need to be publishing if you want to be seen and if you want to succeed in certain journals on certain topics with certain people, that you don't choose yourself freely. And there goes with it academic freedom and the freedom of the scientists to do whatever they like. If they do whatever they like, of course they can be non-mainstream and never come to the fore. But this is a risk that needs to be on a level playing field. It's a risk that you're taking with open eyes and knowing where you're going. Not because it is what it is. And again, I'll say, you publish or perish. It should be your own choice. It's hardly ever the case nowadays.
Wainer, I would like to thank you for being on the podcast today and for sharing what the mega trends of academia are and how they impact the day-to-day activities of the researchers. You have observed what is desirable and what is not so desirable about them, and therefore what we should consider when planning for a systemic change. Finally, you have unpacked the publish or perish mantra. It's very important to understand the issues that we deal with so that we can have an intelligent discussion and plan for effective solutions. Thank you, Wainer, and thank you to our audience. Till the next time. Thank you for listening to this podcast. For more episodes, please check out our website at remo-network.eu. ReMO is spelled REMO-network.eu. The podcast was brought to you by the Researcher Mental Health Observatory, Cost Action number 19117. I am Federica Bressan, host and producer of this podcast. Additional audio editing by Davide Linzi.